Perfect. So thanks so much for coming to the online Causal Inference seminar this week. We are really excited to have Guido Imbens from Stanford, our own Guido, and he's going to talk about identification of non-parametric factor models for average treatment effects. And Susan Athey is in the question and answers. So if you can submit the questions, she'll be able to answer it as well. And after the talk, Bryan Graham from UC Berkeley will discuss the talk. So, and then Sarah is going to handle the questions today. So Sarah?
Yes, thank you, Naki. I think you already said everything. So there will be, please use the question answering system instead of the chat. And then there will be Susan Athey who will be answering the questions during the talk. And if some questions require longer answers, then we'll discuss them after the talk and after the discussion. So thank you. And Guido, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I should take about 45 minutes and then leave it to
yes.
Bryan. So let me share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so first of all, this is joint work with Susan, who's here also on the panel. And so we're interested in estimating average treatment effect. We're interested in estimating causal effects in a panel setting, and we want to avoid kind of a lot of the functional form type assumptions that are often made in this literature. So here's the kind of outline. I'll give a brief introduction and talk about the specific model setting we're going to look at. Talk a little bit about the relationship to the earlier literature. I'll give a sketch kind of the identification proof we're relying on. And then I also want to talk a little bit about properties of some of the estimators that have been proposed previously kind of in more restrictive settings and how what their properties look like in this more flexible setting. So I'm going to look at a setting where there's where we have a panel with n units, capital N units, capital T periods. Each unit period pair is characterized by a pair of potential outcomes, YIT0, YIT1. So for the moment, I'm going to assume there's no dynamic treatment effects, even though we're going to allow for fairly flexible correlation over time for a particular unit. We're going to assume that the treatment effect itself is restricted to the period that the unit is treated. So there's just two potential outcomes rather than potential outcomes that depend on the whole sequence of the prior treatments. And so we're going to assume for each unit the period pair, the two variables, the binary the treatment WIT and the outcome corresponding to the control outcome of the units in the control group and the treated outcome of the units in the treatment group. And we're going to look at trying to estimate the average effect for the treated units. We could look at other estimates. That's not going to change things conceptually, but it's going to involve a lot of extra notation. So this is a simpler object to look at. So here's kind of another way of looking at the data. We're going to have this panel where we have this matrix of outcomes where the columns correspond to the time periods and the rows correspond to the units. And we're going to have the similar sized matrix of binary treatments with a bunch of zeros and ones. Occasionally, we'll look at the setting where there's just a single treated unit period because that allows us to link it to parts of the literature, in particular the synthetic control literature that is often focused on that setting. We're going to abstract here from the presence of additional covariates in practice, kind of with these outcomes that often doesn't actually matter all that much in practice for estimation. And we have nothing really very new to say about that here, but they certainly can be incorporated again at the expense of additional notation. So, kind of what do people do in practice in these settings? So one of the most popular things in economics, certainly in the empirical economics literature, is using two-way fixed effects. Essentially, people model the control outcome as in this two-way fixed effect form, where the control outcome has three components. that are additively separable, a unit-specific component alpha I, a time-specific component beta t, and the idiosyncratic component epsilon it. You can generalize that, and there's a bunch of theoretical work on papers on that, as well as some empirical work, allowing for a more general factor structure with a finite number of factors. And then there's also the synthetic control literature, going back to the work by Alberto Abadi and co-authors, kind of actually starting in the early 2000s, particular important papers, the Abadi Diamond Heimmuller 2010 paper, where they don't quite specify as much data generating process as they specify an algorithm for estimating treatment effects, where they match a particular treated unit, often just a single treated unit, to a bunch of control units with these linear coefficients, these weights, omega I, where these weights sum to 1 and are non-negative. And that's become a very popular way of estimating treatment effects in this setting as well. So why do we think that this is not quite satisfactory? Because certainly the first two estimators kind of seem to rely a lot on functional form assumptions. There's this additive separability between this idiosyncratic component and the systematic component, and there's a lot of linearity in the systematic component. In the linear factor model, it's not quite so clear what the role of that linearity is, given that you can in principle approximate these models by linear models, but it means it's not quite clear what the critical assumptions are for causal interpretation of the resulting estimators. And that's particularly striking in our view if you compare that to the cross-section causal inference literature, where sort of a workhorse setup is one where you assume that conditional on a set of observed confounders, here denoted by xi, conditional on those observed confounders, you have independence between the treatment indicator, wi, and the potential outcomes. And that kind of seems a very nice, clean way of formulating the critical assumption, going back to Rosenbaum and Rubin. And that's been very popular in the cross-section empirical literature. Then in addition to that, we typically have an overlap assumption where we say that the probability of getting the treatment is bounded by 1 minus eta for some positive eta, to make sure that every unit has some probability of being in the control group, meaning that we can actually find good matches for every treated unit. If you want to get the overall average effect, you would need to bound the probability also by away from 0. But here, if you're interested in the average effect for the treated, that's not an issue. So what do we want to do here? And so I'm going to kind of formulate this assumption sort of in a couple of different ways. But so the first key assumption is really that there's some unobserved unit components, alpha, there's some unobserved time components, beta, such that different units, unit I and j in this case, observed at the same time, at time t, are independent of each other, conditional on those unobserved components, and in particular conditional on beta t. And so the assumption actually is asymmetric in the unit and time dimension. That's partly because the unit and time dimensions are conceptually clearly very different. We think there may be exchangeability in the unit dimension, but certainly not in the time dimension. The time dimension is ordered in a particular way. And so we're not going to assume that if we look at the outcomes for the same unit at different points in time, we're not going to assume that those outcomes are necessarily independent, even if we conditional on the betas at those time periods, and as well as the unit-specific component. We're also not going to assume that the betas over time are independent, although we are going to need some stationarity assumption, so that we do see repeatedly find the same values of beta over time. So we can't necessarily have trending variables in there without some way of adjusting for that. But we don't need these betas to be independent. We don't need the potential outcomes to be independent over time, but we do need them to be independent across units at the same point in time, and we do need these unit-specific components to be independent or exchangeable. Now, kind of still staying with that assumption, kind of one way of getting to that assumption is to have this non-parametric factor model where we have the potential outcomes generated by some non-parametric, some unspecified function g, evaluated at the unit component alpha I, a time component beta t, and an idiosyncratic component epsilon it, where they may interact with each other in a very flexible way, as long as these epsilon its are independent of both the alphas and the betas. The alphas are independent of the betas. The epsilons are independent across units. They're not necessarily across time. And these alphas, the alphas are independent across units. But again, we would allow for the betas to be correlated over time. And so, kind of still sticking with this assumption, the key interpretation really is that we kind of think of these units at some level as exchangeable, that we can compare different units and conditioning on the betas removes this dependence between the units, but we're going to allow for fairly flexible dependent structures over time. Then the second key assumption, and this looks very much like the ignorability assumption in the cross-section setting, is that if we were to actually observe these unit and time components, the treatment indicator would be independent of the potential outcome. In addition, we're going to make an overlap assumption that the probability of being in the treatment group is bounded away from zero, so we can actually find comparable units. But the key thing is really that if we were to condition on these unit and time specific components, then we would be done. We would have as good as random assignment, and we could directly compare treated and control units, and we could directly leverage all the cross-section literature on how to make those adjustments. Problem, of course, is that we don't see. We cannot directly see these alphas and betas, and it's going to be hard to estimate them because we don't necessarily have enough kind of information to directly enough structure on the model to directly estimate these betas. But so the key insight that I want to talk about is sort of that given this structure and given these two non-parametric assumptions plus sufficient smoothness, and then under asymptotics where both n and t are getting large, but we think of these alphas as being drawn randomly from some fixed distribution, and the betas following some stochastic process, some stationary stochastic process. So we, again, repeatedly encounter the same values of beta. Then the conditional mean of Y0 given alpha and beta is identified, even if we can't get the full function G. But getting to the conditional mean of Y0 given the unit and time components is enough to, in combination with the latent ignorability, is enough to identify the average treatment effect tau, even though we can't directly estimate, nor are we interested in estimating alpha I and beta T. So what do we want to do next? I want to make some comments on the identification result and kind of how to think about the identification here in general. I want to make some connections to the earlier literature, and I want to give some intuition for the result, and kind of in particular there's some interesting aspect about what actually would work here, what wouldn't work here, and what distance measures we use for looking at these units. And then I'm going to make some comments on the linear factor model approaches here, as well as synthetic control approaches here, and show that those are actually likely to be consistent under those conditions, and that they don't necessarily rely on the stronger assumptions that have often been made to justify those estimators. So first comment. So if we made a stronger ignorability assumption, if we just said, well, conditional on alpha I, whether you're in whether a particular unit period combination is in the treatment group or in the control group, is independent of the potential outcomes, then we would essentially be done. We could just, to estimate YIT0 for a treated period, we could just average over all the other periods for that same unit. And if the betas were random, then we would that would be fine. So we wouldn't need to worry about the differences between the units. We would just do the estimation within a particular unit. And similarly, if the conditioning on beta t was sufficient, we could just use other units at the same time, and we would be guaranteed to have the same value for beta, and we would be done. But the challenge is really that we need to account both for the unit component alpha I and the time component beta t, because we only have a single unit period pair where we have both alpha I and beta t. So somehow we need to find a way of getting similar units or getting similar time periods. And so second comment is that the one approach that is sort of used very widely in the cross-section case, and that you might think could work here under some conditions, doesn't actually work. If we try to estimate the potential control outcome for a unit I star who is treated in period T star, if we try to do that by finding a unit J that has outcomes as close as possible to unit I star in all the non-treated periods, in all the control periods. So if we match the unit I to a unit that is as similar as possible in their outcomes, you might think that would end up leading you, if there's a lot of units to choose from, that would lead you to a unit with a similar value for that would lead you to a unit J, where alpha J is similar to alpha I star. But that's not necessarily the case. That would be the case if we had an additive model where the idiosyncratic term was additive in the system compared to the systematic component. But if you have a multiplicative model, and so here's kind of a very simple example where the generative model is alpha I times beta t plus epsilon it, then the closest unit for a particular unit, if unit I star has alpha I star equal to 1, the alphas that are going to minimize that objective function, that are going to be the best matches for large n large t, is going to be units with alpha is equal to 1/2. And so matching is not, in the end, systematically going to lead you to find units with similar values for alpha. So the third set of comments is about the kind of the earlier econometric literature on fixed effects. So in part of that literature, in a large part of that literature, people avoid making any assumptions on the properties of the alpha I and the beta t. So here, what we're going to do is do asymptotics where we get more units that have alphas coming from the same distribution. We don't directly see these alphas, and so we can't directly compare units with the same values of alpha, but we know that in the end there's going to be some units with similar values for alpha, and the same with the betas. For example, the two-way fixed effect literature, people don't make any assumptions on these unit and time fixed effects, and the way they deal with them is directly removing them through transformations. And so whether these alphas are trending or whether they sometimes take very large values, that are not comparable to those for any other units doesn't really matter, because you do this transformation here from YIT to YIT tilde, where you subtract the mean for that unit, you subtract the mean for that time period, and actually, sorry, there's a typo here, and add back in the overall mean, and you get something that only depends on the epsilon ITs, and that has taken out all dependence on alpha I and beta T. So estimation and inference in those settings is conditional on these alpha and betas. It treats them as parameters rather than make any assumptions on that. Here, we're going to view these alphas and betas as stochastic, as having some distribution. We're going to make some assumptions on these distributions. And in the end, we're going to rely on having large enough samples that there is many units with similar values of alpha and beta in there. Because that fixed effect approach kind of doesn't just work in the linear case, even though there it's particularly simple, but there's other cases where people have come up with clever ways of doing transformations so that the fixed effects are removed. In the conditional logit setting, where we have repeated units, we observe binary outcomes. Conditioning on the sum of the successes and failures allows you to also remove the dependence on unit-specific effects. And there's a famous paper by Beauhonoré where he does something similar in a censored regression model setting. Again, by cleverly transforming the data and conditioning on particular subset of the data, he ends up being able to remove the dependence on the alpha I's. We're not going to do that, and that's sort of intrinsic in this non-parametric approach. There's no transformations that get rid of that dependence entirely. We rely on the fact that ultimately there's going to be multiple units with very similar values for alpha and beta. Another literature that's very related to what we're doing here is in a network setting where people model the adjacency matrix, so there's n units, there's the n by n, the symmetric adjacency matrix, assuming that the nodes are exchangeable. The adjacency matrix is often modeled as some function of a unit-specific component alpha I and a unit-specific component alpha j. So looking at the connection between units I and units j, it's a function of the unit component for unit I, unit component for unit j, and an idiosyncratic component, that should be epsilon ij, where all these things are independent, and the function g is unspecified. And as people have studied identification and estimation in that setting, early work with Pickle and some work by Bryan as well. Another literature that is related is that on grouped heterogeneity, where and this is largely in econometric literature, where people have tried to go beyond linear factor models and allowed for group time-specific components, where the group is indicated by the group for unit I is indicated by g of I, and so there's a group time-specific component alpha, g, and t. So the alpha is not entirely unit-specific, but it's constant within groups, but can vary across these groups and over time in an unrestricted way. And then the challenge, of course, is figuring out how to model these groups, and it ends up leading to a very flexible setup relative to a linear factor model. Another literature that's related is that on row and column exchangeable matrices. In the end, we're going to just use the exchangeability across rows, because we don't want to have exchangeability over time. Because of the time ordering, it's very implausible that time component completely removes all the time dependence. But starting from that, there's a literature on modeling the relationship non-parametrically, going back to this work by Yeltsin and Amamiya, and kind of with recent work by Abadi Agarwal and Shah. And in particular, Fang and Abadi Agarwal and Shah kind of look at estimation of causal effects in that setting in a way that's related to what we're doing here. So what I want to do specifically here is kind of, so in this setting, and now I'm going to simplify things slightly, I'm going to assume this generative model where we have an unknown function g that depends on an unobserved unit component alpha I, an unobserved time component beta t, and an idiosyncratic error epsilon it. These epsilon its are independent of beta and alpha. The alphas are drawn randomly from some distribution, they're not observed. These betas follow some stationary process. Again, they're unobserved. And the epsilon it are independent across units and stationary over time. We're going to look at a setting where both the cross-section dimension and the time series dimension get large. And I'll sort of be a little clear kind of why we need that, where we need that. We're going to make some smoothness assumptions, and we mainly need them on the conditional expectation of y given of y0 given both alpha and beta. We need to have that be sufficiently smooth in both the unit and time component. And the last assumption is that we need that if mu of alpha and beta, if mu of alpha and beta is the same as mu of alpha prime and beta, if that's the same for all values of beta, if that function is the same for all values of beta, then it must be the case that alpha is equal to alpha prime, so that because we can't distinguish between two values of alpha that lead to exactly the same conditional mean. We can actually relax it a little bit because at the moment we look just at averages of the y's. If we looked at higher order moments, we could free this up. In practice, that doesn't seem particularly important extension at this stage. So the question is kind of, given these assumptions, how do we identify, how do we estimate first just the value of this function mu evaluated at alpha I and beta t, and then how do we use that for estimating the average treatment effects? And so what we want to do here is essentially following a matching type approach. So starting with a particular unit I that is, we want to at a particular period t, we want to find a set of units j such that the function mu of alpha I and beta is very similar to the function mu of alpha j and beta for all values of beta, so meaning across all periods. We want to find a large set of those units, and then to estimate mu it, we would just average the value of yjt, so at that particular period, over all the units in that set. So at that point, if we've guaranteed that mu of alpha j and beta is the same as, or very close to mu of alpha I and beta, then it must also be the same at that particular value for beta. And so averaging the yjt's at that period is going to give us an estimate of mu of alpha I at that particular value of beta. And so how do we find such a set of units? So I'm going to kind of look at it in two steps. So the first thing is, and this is obviously an infeasible set. I want to just look at, for a particular value of alpha, how do we construct a set of alpha prime such that these functions mu of alpha and beta are the same. Then mu of alpha prime and beta are the same for all values of beta. And the way we do that is by looking at alpha prime such that the covariance between mu evaluated at alpha and beta and mu and alpha double prime and beta is the same as the covariance between mu at alpha prime and beta and mu at alpha double prime and beta for all beta. So we're looking at the covariance kind of over time between the mu for a particular value of alpha and another value, alpha double prime, and we want that to be the same as the covariance between mu evaluated at alpha prime and alpha double prime. And we want that to be the same for all other alpha prime. So we say, so let me kind of restate that, because this is an important step here. So we're trying to find units with a similar value of alpha. And we're not going to do that by directly comparing outcomes for unit I and unit j, but we're going to look at the covariance between unit I and some other unit k, and the covariance between unit j and unit k. And if the covariance is the same for all other units k, then it must be that unit I and unit j are similar in terms of their alpha. So how do you show that works? Well, if we find the alpha prime for which this covariance is equal to 0, then it must be that these two functions are actually the same. And kind of that's very easy to see. Substitute in alpha double prime is equal to alpha, and then you'll see that the expectation of mu squared of alpha and beta is the same as the expectation of the product of mu alpha and mu alpha prime. And if you substitute alpha double prime is equal to alpha prime, then you see that the expectation of the square of mu alpha prime is the same as the covariance mu alpha prime. And so the combination of those two implies that the difference between mu alpha and mu alpha prime must have expectation 0 when the expectation is taken over beta. Now, this in itself is not very helpful, because we don't know what these mu's are. We don't know what alpha is. We don't know what beta is. We don't directly know what these mu's are. But what we can do is substitute in the outcomes for these mu's. And now the fact that we started off assuming independence between unit I and unit k conditional on these betas means that the expectation of these products averaged over time are going to be equal to the expectation of the products of mu of alpha I and alpha k. So even though we can't directly look for units that have the same covariance for these functions mu, we can look for units that have the same covariance in terms of the of other units k. And so what we're going to do in the end, the feasible version of this, is for a given unit I, if we want to find a set of matches, we're going to look for units j such that the average of yit, ykt is very similar to the average of yjt, ykt, not just for some unit k, but for every other unit k. Because that's going to be a big challenge. And this is where we're going to need both n and k to be large. We need n and t to be large. We need t to be large so that we are estimating for any pair I and k, we need to estimate that average very well. But then we need the n to be large so that we have enough units k to actually compare what the covariance is, to make sure that the covariance is 0, is close to 0 for all other units. And so it's going to be somewhat delicate balance between having both n and t equal be large. In fact, to make sure that we have uniform convergence there, we need t to be very large relative to the number of units. But then if we very slowly let the number of units get large, we're going to get the average over t of that expectation, of the maximum of all the units of that expectation to be approximating the integral over that expectation over of all the units.
So Guido,
Yeah.
there was a question in the chat about like the choice of the distance metric, which you've partially answered on this slide, but I wonder if you could just circle back around to answer like why this distance metric and what makes it attractive for our problem.
Yeah, so I mean that's a very intriguing question. So I'm not sure I have a very complete answer there. So that other than just doing a simple distance measure doesn't work, kind of as the example I showed. So, and one way to interpret that is that we're not trying to match units on the outcomes. We would like to match them on the conditional expectations. And the outcomes are noisy measures of that. So we need to somehow find a way of getting around that the noise in that measure. And by using these units k, that's still, but we know they have the same value for beta, essentially works a little bit as an instrument to get at the signal at a particular time period t, and see that the signal is the same in units I and units j. So there's certainly going to be alternative distance measures that are possible, and in fact we will, for the causal inference version of this problem, we're going to need some additional structure on this distance measure, but it's always going to involve multiple units to deal with what is essentially measurement error in these mu's. What we see is not the mu's, but the mu plus noise, and we need to find a way of getting rid of that noise. The same way, if we did a regression of of units on the other units, the fact that we have all this measurement error and we don't, it would be great if we could do a regression of yit on mu jt, mu alpha j beta t, but we can't do that. And if we did a regression on the other y's, we would get biased estimates from the measurement error. So maybe that wasn't a very
yeah. So yes, you probably should keep going.
precise
Maybe
answer,
just
it's dealing with the measurement. Yeah.
Yeah, and two other just very quick points is that we're looking for an average treatment effect. So if we were looking for some other moment of the distribution, there might be a different condition. And then also, like, I think what's showing on this slide now is that this particular distance metric is feasible, and we can get at it with the correlations of the outcomes. So
Yeah.
it's sort of implementable. But we've got, you've just got a few minutes, so I should let you keep going.
Yeah, thanks. So let me kind of just comment sort of on that similarity distance, kind of to what it actually looks like in simpler settings. So if you have a two-way fixed effect model, if you look at it, that expectation of the difference between mu alpha prime multiplied with mu alpha double prime, that is equivalent to the difference between alpha and alpha prime multiplied by alpha double prime plus the expectation of beta. So if you want that to be equal to 0 for all values of alpha double prime, then it's clear what you need is alpha to be equal to alpha prime. So in the two-way fixed effect model, that certainly is a natural condition. Similarly, in a linear factor model, this essentially amounts to requiring that the expectation of beta prime has full rank. Now let me then I'm gonna run out of time soon. Let me make some comments. And this is really one of the things we find most intriguing here. So synthetic control has been motivated sometimes kind of based on linear factor models, but often without directly generating model as motivation. But it actually seems like it may be consistent here. So as long as again, n and t both go to infinity, and t gets large relative to n. And kind of to get some intuition for why that may be the case is look at suppose we have a particular unit n that is treated in a particular period. So what synthetic control does is choose a set of weights, a convex set of weights that sum to 1 and are non-negative to minimize particular objective functions. So here we split that objective function into a couple of components. And now what you can see is that the first component is going to be minimized if we find a bunch of units that have the same value for alpha. If you use any other units, you cannot. So if you use a weighted average only of units with very similar values of alpha, you can drive that first component to as close to 0 as possible. The other components are going to be of lower order if the number of time periods is very large. So it looks like synthetic control is going to focus on weights that are 0 for units with different functions, mu of alpha and beta, and set the weights, make the weights equal and small for the units with similar values of alpha. And in large samples, there's going to be many of those, and so that gets rid of that third term. So you end up minimizing that objective function. But it's key here that you use the convexity restriction, both that the weights are non-negative and that they sum up to 1, to deal with what is essentially the measurement error problem in the regression that synthetic control is doing of the outcomes for the treated unit on the outcomes for the control unit. If you did an unrestricted regression, all those coefficients would get closer to 0 than what you would need for the optimal answer here to get consistency. Finally, the matrix completion, kind of using linear factor models, where you allow the number of factors to grow with the sample size, and you can do that through regularization, kind of as we did in this earlier paper with Dmitry Arkhangelski and others. If you let the number of factors get large, and there we did this through nuclear norm regularization, but you can probably do it in other ways, then you can then it looks like you can also get a consistent estimator. Essentially, you can linearize that function. But what using the non-parametric setup contributes here is that it makes clear what you fundamentally need. Fundamentally, you need there to be some component, some unit component, some time component, such that conditional on those, the assignment is independent, and it's not necessarily independent of the residual in the linear factor model, but it's independent in the non-parametric version. So let me stop here and turn it over to Bryan. But what we find attractive in this setup is that it gets closer to the cross-section setup, where you can make the critical assumptions in a functional form free way, and it allows you to reinterpret some of the existing estimation approaches in a much more general setting. All right, so let me stop here.
Great. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are.
And so, Bryan, we're not seeing the full screen yet.
Oh,
No.
yeah, thank you.
Maybe press Command L.
No.
Control L.
How can you see it now? No.
It's
No,
okay. We
control
don't mind seeing your little outline. Go ahead.
Now I'm having, there we go. Great. So my computer's now going on the fritz. Well, I'm just going to continue and hopefully you can hear me. I'm just going to do it this way. My name is Bryan, and I just want to make a few comments on the presentation. You know, first of all, it was a fantastic presentation. The last time I discussed a paper by Guido, it actually inspired me to do research on networks, which has been an important part of my career the past decade or so. So a good paper always opens up new questions for others, and I think this paper is definitely in that category. I just wanted to make a kind of a couple comments about panel data and causal inference as I see it. I'm probably a little more familiar with the panel data literature. I kind of dip in and out of the causal inference research world. And the connection and the paper, you know, the presentation alluded to the connection between these two literatures is somewhat unsatisfactory in my mind. So I'll come back to this at the end. But there's sort of three panel data worlds, and I think it's helpful to articulate them and then situate this paper in what I think is the one it occupies. There's the world of strict exogeneity that Chamberlain articulated in his early work. Later in his career, he explored richer models that allowed for more heterogeneous feedback. And I'll articulate what I mean by that at the end of the presentation. And then there's the world of what I'll call homogeneous feedback, which appears in the causal inference literature and say, you know, most famously the work of Jamie Robbins, but also shows up in structural I/O and in econometrics. And I would say this paper, the latent unconfoundedness assumption, really puts it in bucket A, but with the very important nonparametric formulation of the data generating process. Okay, so what I'm going to mostly spend my time doing is giving a very quick recap of the matching algorithm, because I think that will be most helpful to the audience, and then I'll make a few connections, but just a few reminders. There's n cross-sectional units, there's observed in t periods, it's a binary treatment, and the target is the average treatment effect on the treated. We're going to assume a non-parametric factor model. You know, in listening to the presentation, I realized that some of the things that I wrote on my slide may not be exactly correct, but they're close enough, I think, for today's purposes. So there's exchangeability in the cross-sectional dimension, so that we can think of the AIs. Sorry, I changed since the alphas are random. I decided they should be Roman letters, so now they're AIs in my presentation. So the AIs are IID, the UITs are IID, although it appears that some dependence in the time series dimension is allowed, and the Bs may be dependent over time, although there's a stationarity restriction. And then we have this important conditional expectation, which is the mean of the potential outcome under control for a given value of the individual unit-specific effect and the time effect. And this object's well defined, you know, under the assumptions made in the presentation, but it's not, quote, directly identified. And we'll see what I mean by that in a moment. A quick comment about latent unconfoundedness. So, you know, there's always this tension between, you know, working in a more kind of traditional likelihood setting and working with the potential outcomes notation. And I think this paper is actually an example of how going back and forth between the two can be quite illuminating. It probably would have been helpful for me to just sort of see what the joint likelihood of the potential outcome under control and the treatment matrix looks like, you know, all these sort of different assumptions, how that would sort of map out in a likelihood setting. So, you know, here I'm making a conditional independent assumption, I think a little stronger than what's made in the paper. And under the nonparametric factor model, it coincides with a stronger version of, you know, what Chamberlain would have called strict exogeneity. So just a small comment, and I think a useful connection. Okay, so what I want to talk about now mostly is the matching algorithm. I'm just going to be very heuristic here to help hopefully give the audience a sense of what's going on and why this works. I think it's a pretty cool. And I think it's useful to begin thinking about a setting where we observed the muse. And if we observe the muse, then we could define a set of neighbors for each unit. And that would be this index set here, right? So you for unit I, you find a set of units j where these two conditional means are close to one another. And of course, in a finite n, finite t setting, you have to pick some threshold. That should be an n there. And so one idea is you could just let qi be, say, the sample quantile of the difference. So the idea is, you don't have to worry about the details, but the idea is you might pick the 10 closest neighbors by this metric in the sample. Okay, and if you could do that, then sorry for the technological problems. If you could do that, then you could construct a simple oracle estimator, which would just look at the, this should be a j here. You could look at the average y's over the neighbors j of unit I in period t. And this would be an estimate essentially of the expected outcome under control for unit I in period t. Right, and this should be consistent for mu ai bt. You know, if n grows large, as mentioned in the presentation, that's to ensure that the cardinality of the number of neighbors grows large, that this average, the number of summands in this average grows large. And we also need t to grow large as well, because it ensures that these matches here are good, and hence we can allow this cutoff to go to 0 fast enough to get rid of bias. And so that's really great, but this is an oracle procedure. It's kind of circular. Of course, you can estimate mu really well if you observe mu. And the neat trick is to recognize that you can do something that in the networks literature is called codegree matching. I actually learned about this from my student, Eric Auerbach. And I don't know if the Zhang, Levina Zhu paper cited in the presentation as a primitive reference, but it was an early reference that I was exposed to. And that's the idea that actually this codegree, in some sense, bounds above this infeasible metric. So if they're both 0 or both close, you know, if this is close to 0, then the other infeasible metric will be close to 0 as well. And so the idea is we find a set of neighbors where, as mentioned in the presentation, the covariance between yi t and ykt is very similar on average over periods to the covariance between yj t and ykt. And once we estimate this index set, we can construct a feasible estimator like so. And the setting here is a little different in the network setting because you only have exchangeability in one dimension. And as I was listening to the presentation, I realized that is more interesting than maybe I'd appreciate when I was writing my slides yesterday. But the basic trick here is, as mentioned in the presentation, is you've got to let T grow so that the quality of these matches gets good enough, and N to grow so that we get enough of them. Okay, so it's just some references. The first one was mentioned in the presentation. This I have to make a plug for Eric, because he was my student. It's also where I learned about this. Eric Auerbach uses a similar approach in his dissertation for a different purpose, but related nevertheless. I thought there was the connection between this setup and the more parametric panel data literature, and as well as the synthetic control literature, I found very interesting. So the presentation points out that in a linear factor model setting, the members of this index set will just be units that have similar AIs and AJs, will be units J that have alphas that are similar to unit I's alphas. Okay, so that's all great. Yeah, I've said this already. We observe many units. Because we observe each unit under control for many periods, we can find many good matches, and that's really the trick. And I think it's really slick, and I think very useful. Some big picture hogwashery, and this is really mostly kind of just some questions for everyone, really. Not just the authors. There's sort of this uncomfortable fact that at least in economics, panel data is one of the most features in almost every applied microeconomic research design that is trying to make causal statements. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. But as I'm quoting from the presentation, the critical assumptions for causal interpretations are not clear or plausible. I as an outsider, I find this literature very hard to follow, both because I have a difficulty connecting it to the sort of more parametric likelihood-based panel data literature, which I'm more familiar with, and I even struggle sometimes understanding on its own terms. And I think this project really has the potential to kind of substantiate these discussions and really move the needle forward. So I find that very exciting. It wasn't clear to me in the presentation, but I think it's true that you need some restriction like this, that there's sort of no feedback, that treatment assignment, the density, I guess this could be a probability, the probability to be assigned treatment in period T, given your past treatment assignment and your past, outcomes under control, doesn't depend on those past outcomes under control. I think that's a requirement, and I think that's that assumption's implicit in say the differences in differences literature and other empirical literatures that meld panel data and causal inference. But I think it's a very strong assumption, and it kind of rules out something we'd like to allow for with panel data. The idea that a state might adjust their minimum wage precisely because of the nature of labor market conditions in the recent past, right? So we want to allow for feedback, and I think that would be an area to explore in future work. And there's actually this lovely paper by my advisor, Gary, in Econometrica, which sort of has kind of been forgotten, which really has some useful results here that I think could contribute to this discussion. That's really all I have to say. Wonderful paper. It was a pleasure I actually, as my other early career mentor would say, a lovely forthcoming working paper. Yeah, thank you.
It is. It will be out on archive when the archived gods make it so shortly.
Okay, imminently forthcoming.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So, Guido, do you have some responses?
Yeah, so just a couple of things. I totally agree with Bryan's comments about sort of some of the causal panel literature being somewhat uncomfortably disconnected from the dynamic panel literature that he was referencing, and I think that's still an area where there's a lot more work to be done. This is absolutely right. This is sort of in a different part of that literature, trying to free up another part of the modern causal panel literature that we find unsatisfactory, but it doesn't dismiss the concerns he has with other parts of that. And so I think there's just a lot more work to be done. I think he's right sort of on the process for the W's, whether there's feedback there, something that needs to be addressed clearly. So, but thanks. Those were very helpful comments, and clearly there's a lot more to be done. Slightly in my defense, I was signed up for this seminar 2 weeks ago, so there wasn't a huge amount of time to finish everything there.
And did you want to?
The feedback is abundantly positive. I sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Susan. I'll just I think this is a huge area, and I think the sort of opportunities for connecting. It's ironic that panel data in econometrics was explored precisely because of its potential to allow for causal statements. Of course, the literature arose in a setting where maybe the language and the sophistication that's available now in the causal inference literature wasn't available, but that was really the motivation. And I think there's a lot to be gained by revisiting these issues. And I'll stop there. Sorry to interrupt you, Susan.
No, I was actually just going to say, Guido, there's 2 questions I flagged in the Q&A to be possibly answered live that might bear some elaboration if we have time. I don't know. Just the first one was basically just like, do you want to talk a little bit more about whether we're putting restrictions on the data, what's testable, and what the constraints are? And then the second one was about persistent treatment, which relates to Roshan's third question that you answered in the chat about matching based on treatment status.
Yeah, I'm seeing the question. Sort of, is the first assumption really an assumption on its own? I'm not completely sure. And then kind of the second part, so does it place any constraints on the full counterfactual data distribution beyond independence across units? I'm not completely sure, and I think that's sort of a very interesting question. It's sort of goes back to the unease kind of with some of the earlier ways of formulating these models. I think it's really sort of, and for a while I actually sort of thought maybe the cross section unconfounded in this case was just very special, that we could formulate these very clear and crisp and interpretable assumptions, and that was just not a generic case. I think I'm a little bit more positive now that we can do this in the panel case as well, but we're still not quite there. And exactly what we need there, and how much of it is definitional versus how much of it is actually restrictive. Clearly, the unconfoundedness assumption is restrictive. We cannot allow for we cannot deal with the possibility that units are treated in periods where their outcome is particularly high and their potential control outcome is particularly different from other units in some systematic way. And exactly how much we can allow for isn't completely clear. So we can, in some sense, the matching algorithm almost seems to define kind of what we mean by these alphas and these betas. It's not just that we say there's an alpha such that the generative model has this form, but it's sort of that all the unit-specific components are captured by a particular factor of unobserved components, and that solves the unconfounded, that solves the ignorability concerns, the endogeneity concerns we have. But I think it's still not completely clear what exactly the best way of formulating that is. The stationarity assumption for beta. So I think that is a concern, because in many cases we have panel data where the data are trending and where things are non-stationary. But what we do need here is we use the time series dimension to make sure that we distinguish between units that have different values of alpha. And we may not quite need the stationarity there. It may be that having the data be trending is fine, as long as it's trending in a way that still maintains our ability to distinguish between different the different alphas. And so that's kind of where sort of one of the things that really working on this presentation that drove home to me is the fact that in much research on panel data, we treat the unit and time dimensions very symmetrically, but they really are very different. And the type of assumptions we should be making on the time series dimension versus the cross-section dimension should be correspondingly different. And the linear factor model, of course, actually is symmetric in that way. And that doesn't seem quite right. The time series dimension has a very, very particular structure, and there's very important correlations over time that should be clear from the assumptions we're making, how they allow for that. So I'm not sure about the specific answer to the question here, but that it's very important to deal better kind of with the time series structure, both on the treatments along the lines of what Bryan was saying, along the lines of what Liang Zhong's question is saying.
So maybe just like more succinctly, like in a specific application, you might end up, trading off different kinds of assumptions, but the bottom line is kind of, at least in the approach we're taking, is the ability to match. And so you could imagine like a bit of a literature, if you had certain kinds of data sets that had certain kinds of non-stationarity, then you could really like hone in and tailor the approach. And I think when it comes to estimation also, there will be a lot more work to do to make the approach, the estimation approach, kind of respect the identification principles, but also be tailored to, what variation you have in your data and so on. So this is kind of more, I think, a way to, I think we've learned a lot about how to think about the problem, but there will be probably many different like implementations of the broader idea.
Yeah. So I think the estimation, the suggestion for an estimation procedure is more a proof of concept than that it's a proposal for actually doing that in practice.
So I'm sure that there are more questions, but all the questions will be shared with the presenters. So let me wrap up. Okay. So let me make this bigger. So first of all, thanks so much, Guido and Graham and Susan, for wonderful presentations and discussions. We had amazing turnout this week. And we're going to have another amazing talk next week by Dylan Small. So I hope you come next week as well to the online Causal Inference seminar. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Great to see you guys. Thanks, Bryan.